The Naval Base Hospital corridor echoed with the soft squeaking of Admiral Richardson's polished shoes against the linoleum floor. He had been walking these halls for 23 years, yet today felt different. The weight of command sat heavier on his shoulders as he approached room 247, where Lieutenant Sarah Chun lay, recovering for what the medical reports called extensive thoracic injuries sustained during combat operations. Sarah had been unconscious for 3 days following the helicopter crash that claimed 2 of her crew members. The rescue mission off the coast of Somalia had gone wrong when insurgents fired a rocket-propelled grenade at their Black Hawk. She had pulled her injured co-pilot from the wreckage while under enemy fire, sustaining severe injuries herself in the process. The president himself had called Admiral Richardson that morning, inquiring about the condition of the young officer whose heroism had already reached the highest levels of government. Admiral Richardson paused outside her door, reviewing the medical file one more time. Multiple rib fractures, punctured lung, severe lacerations across her torso. The doctors had worked for 6 hours to stabilize her condition. What troubled him most was not the extent of her injuries, but what he had learned about her background during his investigation into her service record. Lieutenant Chun had graduated top of her class from the Naval Academy 4 years ago. Her performance evaluations were flawless, her dedication unquestionable. Yet there were gaps in her personal history that had raised questions during her security clearance review. Questions that had been brushed aside due to her exceptional service record, but questions nonetheless. He knocked gently on the door before entering. Sarah was awake, staring out the window at the gray Atlantic Ocean visible in the distance. Her dark hair was pulled back, revealing a face that looked younger than her 26 years, despite the weariness in her brown eyes. Bandages covered much of her torso, and various monitoring devices tracked her vital signs. "Admiral Richardson," she said, attempting to sit up straighter despite the obvious pain the movement caused. Her voice was hoarse from the breathing tube that had been removed just hours earlier. "Please, Lieutenant, don't strain yourself," he said, pulling up the visitor's chair beside her bed. "I wanted to personally check on your condition and commend you for your actions during the rescue operation." Sarah's eyes remained fixed on the window. "Thank you, sir. I was just doing my job. Your job didn't require you to go back into that burning helicopter to save Petty Officer Martinez. The doctors say you were bleeding heavily from your chest wounds when you pulled him out." A slight smile crossed her lips. "Martinez has 3 kids at home. His wife is pregnant with their 4th. I couldn't leave him there." Admiral Richardson had read the witness statements. Despite her own injuries, Sarah had crawled back into the wreckage twice. First to retrieve Martinez, and then to recover sensitive communications equipment that could have compromised ongoing operations if it fell into enemy hands. Her actions had saved a life and prevented a potential intelligence breach. "The Navy Cross Committee will be reviewing your actions," he said. "What you did out there was extraordinary." Sarah finally turned to look at him directly. "Sir, if I may ask, is there something else you wanted to discuss?" Admiral Richardson had spent decades reading people, and he could see the guarded expression that had crossed her face. She knew this wasn't just a routine visit from a superior officer checking on a wounded subordinate. "Lieutenant, during your medical treatment, some questions have arisen about previous injuries. The doctors noted evidence of older trauma to your chest and ribs. Injuries that appear to have been sustained years before you entered military service." The color drained from Sarah's face. She turned back toward the window, her jaw tightening slightly. "I see. These injuries show signs of having been quite severe. Multiple fractures that healed without proper medical treatment. The radiologist described them as consistent with." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Consistent with systematic physical trauma over an extended period." The silence stretched between them for nearly a minute. Admiral Richardson could hear the steady beeping of the heart monitor, which had increased its pace slightly since he had raised the topic. "Sir, with respect, I'm not sure how my medical history relates to my service record," Sarah said finally. "It relates because the Navy has a responsibility to understand the backgrounds of our officers, particularly those being considered for commendation and advancement. It also relates because if there were circumstances in your past that might have been overlooked during your initial security screening, we need to address them now. Sarah's hands gripped the bedsheets. Admiral Richardson noticed her knuckles were scarred as well, faint white lines across her fingers that spoke of old wounds. The injuries you sustained this week weren't your first experience with broken ribs, he said gently. Were they, Lieutenant? She closed her eyes, and Admiral Richardson saw her take several deep breaths before responding. When she opened them again, there was a resigned look that made her appear both older and more vulnerable than before. No, sir, they weren't. Admiral Richardson leaned forward slightly. Sarah, I want you to know that whatever you tell me stays between us, unless there are ongoing safety concerns that require action. But I need to understand what happened to you. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across the hospital room. Sarah watched a seagull circling outside the window before she spoke again. My father was career Navy, sir. Commander James Chun. He served with distinction for 22 years. Admiral Richardson knew the name. Commander Chun had been killed in a training accident when Sarah was 17, just months before she had applied to the Naval Academy. He was also an alcoholic, she continued, her voice becoming quieter. When he drank, which was often toward the end of his career, he became violent. The pieces were beginning to come together for Admiral Richardson. He had wondered how a young woman from a military family could have such extensive medical trauma without it appearing in her background investigation. The injuries the doctors found, he said carefully, your father caused them? Sarah nodded, still not looking at him. It started when I was about 12. At first it was just slaps, grabbing me too hard when he was angry. But as I got older and started standing up to him, especially when he went after my mother, it got worse. Admiral Richardson felt a familiar anger rising in his chest, the same protective instinct that had driven him throughout his career when he encountered injustice. Did you ever seek medical treatment? A few times, but he was careful about where he hit me, and when I had to go to the emergency room, he would always come with me. He would tell the doctors I had fallen or been in an accident, and they never questioned a Navy commander bringing in his injured daughter. The irony was devastating. The very uniform and rank that should have represented honor and protection had been used to enable abuse and cover up the evidence. What about your mother? Sarah's expression hardened. She knew, but she was terrified of him too. She kept telling me that if we could just get through until I graduated high school, everything would be okay, that I could go to college and get away from him. Is that why you applied to the Naval Academy? For the first time since the conversation began, Sarah looked directly at Admiral Richardson. You probably think that's strange, wanting to join the same service that had shaped the man who hurt me. I think it shows incredible strength of character, he replied. You didn't let his actions destroy your belief in what the Navy stands for. The Navy gave me everything he never did, she said. Purpose, honor, a family that actually cares about protecting each other. When I took my oath as a midshipman, I swore I would never let anyone use their authority to hurt someone weaker the way he hurt me and my mother. Admiral Richardson understood now why she had risked her life to save Petty Officer Martinez, why she had gone back into that burning helicopter despite her own injuries. She had spent her entire adult life trying to be everything her father wasn't. Lieutenant, I need you to know that what your father did was not your fault, and it doesn't reflect on your fitness for service in any way. But it does explain why I never talked about my family during my academy interviews, doesn't it? She said. Why I always changed the subject when people asked about my childhood or what inspired me to serve. It explains why you're one of the most dedicated officers I've ever encountered, Admiral Richardson said, and why every person you've served with speaks of you with such respect. The heart monitor continued its steady beeping, but Sarah's breathing had become more labored as the conversation continued. Admiral Richardson could see that discussing these memories was taking a physical toll on her already weakened condition. Sir, there's something else you should probably know, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Admiral Richardson waited, giving her time to find the words. The night he died in that training accident. The investigation ruled it pilot error, but I always wondered. She trailed off, staring at her hands. What did you wonder, Lieutenant? Whether it really was an accident? He had been drinking more heavily in the weeks before. He knew the Navy was going to force him into retirement. He had gotten into a physical altercation with another officer, and there were going to be formal charges filed. The implications of what she was suggesting hung in the air between them. Admiral Richardson had read the accident report himself when he had looked into her background. A routine training flight that ended in catastrophe when an experienced pilot made a series of uncharacteristic errors. You think he might have crashed deliberately? I don't know. And I've never said that to anyone before. But the man I knew was too proud to face the humiliation of a court-martial and forced retirement. He had always said he would rather die than lose his commission. Admiral Richardson sat back in his chair, processing everything Sarah had told him. The young woman lying in this hospital bed had endured years of abuse from the person who should have protected her most, had lost her father under circumstances that left her wondering if it was suicide, and had still chosen to dedicate her life to serving her country with honor and distinction. Lieutenant Chun, he said finally, I want you to focus on recovering from your injuries. We'll discuss the recognition you deserve for your heroism once you're back on your feet. As he stood to leave, Sarah called out to him, Admiral, thank you for letting me tell someone. I've been carrying this alone for so long. Admiral Richardson paused at the door. You're not alone anymore, Lieutenant. You have a Navy family now, and we take care of our own. As he walked back down the corridor, Admiral Richardson's mind was already working through the implications of what he had learned. Sarah Chun represented everything the Navy stood for at its best, forged in the crucible of personal tragedy into an officer of exceptional courage and integrity. But her story also highlighted the failures of a system that had allowed her father's abuse to continue unchecked for years. He thought about the awards ceremony that would inevitably follow once news of her heroism spread. The media would want to know about the young officer who had risked everything to save her fellow service members. They would dig into her background, and eventually, someone would discover the truth about her childhood. Sarah deserved better than to have her private trauma become public spectacle. She had earned the right to tell her story on her own terms in her own time. Admiral Richardson made a mental note to ensure that her privacy would be protected, even as her heroism was celebrated. The sun was setting as he reached his office, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded him why he had fallen in love with the sea all those years ago. Tomorrow he would begin the process of ensuring that Lieutenant Sarah Chun received the recognition she deserved. But tonight he would go home to his own family and be grateful for the reminder that courage often comes from the most unexpected places. In room 247, Sarah lay awake long after the Admiral had left, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. For the first time in her adult life, she had told someone the complete truth about her past. The weight of carrying those secrets alone had been lifted from her shoulders, replaced by something she had rarely allowed herself to feel. Hope for the future 3 weeks had passed since Admiral Richardson's visit to the hospital, and Sarah was finally cleared to return to limited duty. The physical therapy had been grueling, but her determination to regain full strength had impressed even the most experienced medical staff. She still felt occasional sharp pains when she breathed deeply, and her left shoulder remained stiff, but she could function normally for the first time since the crash. What she hadn't expected was the media attention that had begun to swirl around her story. Someone had leaked details about the rescue mission to a reporter from the Naval Times, and suddenly, her heroism was being discussed in newspapers across the country. The initial reports had focused solely on her actions during the helicopter crash, but Sarah knew it was only a matter of time before journalists began digging deeper in her background. Admiral Richardson had kept his word about protecting her privacy, but there were limits to what even a flag officer could control. The Navy's Public Affairs Office was fielding dozens of interview requests, and the pressure to capitalize on the positive publicity was mounting from higher levels of command. Sarah was reviewing after-action reports in her temporary desk assignment when Lieutenant Commander Patricia Valdez knocked on her door. Patricia had been Sarah's mentor since her first assignment, a helicopter pilot with 15 years of experience who had taken a younger officer under her wing. "Mind if I come in?" Patricia asked, holding 2 cups of coffee from the base cafeteria. "Please do. I could use the company," Sarah replied, grateful for any distraction from the stack of paperwork that had accumulated during her recovery. Patricia closed the door behind her and handed Sarah one of the cups before settling into the chair across from her desk. "How are you holding up? And don't give me the standard fine ma'am response. I want the real answer." Sarah had always appreciated Patricia's direct approach. At 38, Patricia had seen enough military politics and bureaucracy to cut through the formalities when dealing with people she cared about. "Honestly, I feel like I'm living in someone else's life. 3 weeks ago, I was just another helicopter pilot trying to do my job. Now people are calling me a hero and wanting to know everything about my personal history." "The hero part is accurate," Patricia said. "I've read the witness statements from the other crew members. What you did out there was extraordinary by any measure. I keep hearing that, but it doesn't feel extraordinary to me. Martinez needed help, so I helped him. The communications equipment couldn't fall into enemy hands, so I secured it. Those weren't heroic decisions, they were just necessary ones." Patricia studied Sarah's face carefully. She had noticed changes in the younger woman since the accident, a guardedness that hadn't been there before. "Sarah, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Admiral Richardson visited you in the hospital. Whatever you two discussed seemed to affect you deeply. Your whole demeanor changed after that conversation." Sarah set down her coffee cup and looked out the window at the flight line, where helicopters were conducting routine training exercises. She had been dreading this moment, knowing that eventually someone would notice her changed behavior. "He asked about my medical history, about injuries that showed up on the x-rays that weren't related to the crash." Patricia's expression grew more serious. As a senior officer and pilot, she had undergone extensive training in recognizing signs of domestic violence and abuse among service members. "Old injuries? From before I joined the Navy. From when I was growing up." The pieces began to fall into place for Patricia. She had always wondered about Sarah's reluctance to discuss her family background, her tendency to change the subject whenever personal topics came up during their conversations over the years. "Your father?" Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she spoke. Patricia leaned forward in her chair. "Oh, Sarah, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. Nobody did. That was the point. He was very careful about maintaining appearances, especially in public. Commander James Chun, decorated naval officer, devoted family man. The perfect image of military leadership. But behind closed doors? Behind closed doors, he was a drunk who took his frustrations out on me and my mother. The injuries Admiral Richardson asked about were from years of being his personal stress relief." Patricia felt a familiar anger rising in her chest. She had seen too many cases of domestic violence during her career, both among civilian families and within military households. The fact that Sarah's abuser had been a fellow naval officer made it even more disturbing. "Did you ever try to get help?" "Where would I go? He was a commander with an impeccable reputation. I was a teenager with no credibility. Even if someone had believed me, he had friends throughout the command structure who would have protected him." "What about your mother? Did she try to intervene?" Sarah's expression darkened. "My mother was terrified of him. She had been beaten down emotionally for so many years that she couldn't even protect herself, let alone me. She kept promising that things would get better, that he would change, but they never did." Patricia had dealt with enough domestic violence situations to understand the complex dynamics that kept victims trapped in abusive relationships. The isolation, the fear, the gradual erosion of self-worth that made escape seem impossible. "Is that why you joined the Navy? To get away from him?" "Partly, but also because I wanted to prove that not everyone who wears this uniform is like him. I wanted to be the kind of officer who actually protects people instead of hurting them." Patricia understood now why Sarah had always been so dedicated to her crew members, why she went above and beyond to ensure their safety and well-being. She was determined to be everything her father hadn't been. "Sarah, you know that what happened to you wasn't your fault, right?" "Intellectually, yes. But there's still a part of me that wonders if I could have done something differently, if I could have been stronger or braver. You were a child. You survived something that would have broken most adults. And look what you've accomplished despite everything you endured. Sarah managed a small smile. Admiral Richardson said something similar. It's strange how telling someone the truth after all these years can be both terrifying and liberating at the same time. Are you planning to tell anyone else? I don't know. Part of me wants to keep it private, but I'm realizing that secrets have a way of coming out eventually, especially with all this media attention focused on me now. Patricia had been thinking about the same issue. The Navy's Public Affairs Office was under pressure to arrange interviews and photo opportunities to capitalize on Sarah's heroism. It was only a matter of time before some enterprising journalist decided to investigate her family background. Have you thought about getting ahead of the story? Telling it on your own terms rather than having someone else discover it and sensationalize it? The thought has crossed my mind, but I'm not sure I'm ready for that level of public scrutiny. It's one thing to tell Admiral Richardson or you about what happened. It's another to have it discussed on the evening news. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, Sarah's administrative assistant, peeked his head in. "Ma'am, excuse the interruption, but Admiral Richardson's aide called. He'd like to see you in his office at 1500 hours if you're available." Sarah glanced at the clock on her desk. That gave her just over an hour to prepare herself for whatever the Admiral wanted to discuss. "Tell them I'll be there, Chief." "Thank you." After Rodriguez left, Patricia gathered her things to go. "Sarah, whatever Admiral Richardson wants to talk about, remember that you have friends who support you. You don't have to face this alone." "Thank you, Patricia. That means more to me than you know." As Patricia left, Sarah found herself wondering what new development had prompted another meeting with Admiral Richardson. She had hoped that their hospital conversation would be the end of his involvement in her personal situation, but apparently there were still issues that needed to be addressed. She spent the next hour reviewing her medical records and service file, trying to anticipate what questions might arise. The fact that her childhood trauma had been documented in her medical treatment following the crash meant that information was now part of her official Navy record. That reality brought both relief and anxiety. At exactly 3 o'clock, Sarah knocked on Admiral Richardson's office door. His aide, a young ensign named Murphy, ushered her into the spacious room that overlooked the naval base's main harbor. Admiral Richardson was standing at his window, watching a destroyer return from a training exercise. "Lieutenant Shun, thank you for coming. Please have a seat." Sarah sat in one of the leather chairs facing his desk, noting that he seemed more formal than he had been during their hospital conversation. This felt like an official meeting rather than a personal check-in. "Sir, Chief Rodriguez said you wanted to see me." Admiral Richardson turned from the window and took his seat behind the imposing oak desk that had belonged to base commanders for decades. Several folders were arranged neatly in front of him, and Sarah could see her name on at least one of them. "Lieutenant, I wanted to discuss several developments that have arisen since our last conversation. First, the Navy Cross Review Board has completed their evaluation of your actions during the rescue mission. You're being awarded the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism." Sarah felt a mix of pride and discomfort at the announcement. The Navy Cross was the second highest decoration for valor in the naval service, an honor that would change her career trajectory permanently. "Thank you, sir. I'm honored." The award ceremony is being planned for next month. The Secretary of the Navy will be presenting it personally, along with representatives from the other service branches. It's going to be a significant media event. Sarah's heart sank. She had been hoping for a quiet recognition ceremony, something that would acknowledge her actions without drawing national attention to her personal life. "Sir, is there any way to keep the ceremony more low-key?" Admiral Richardson's expression was sympathetic but resigned. "I'm afraid not, Lieutenant. The timing is particularly sensitive from a public relations standpoint. The Navy has been dealing with some negative publicity recently regarding personnel issues, and your story represents exactly the kind of positive leadership we want to highlight." Sarah understood the politics behind his words. Her heroism was being used to counteract other stories about problems within naval leadership, which meant the spotlight on her would be even brighter than usual. That brings me to the second issue we need to discuss, Admiral Richardson continued. The Public Affairs Office has been fielding interview requests from major news outlets. Some reporters have already begun investigating your background. Sarah felt her stomach drop. What kind of investigating? So far, mostly routine biographical research. But one reporter from the Washington Post has been asking specific questions about your father's service record and the circumstances of his death. She seems to have sources within the Veterans Administration who provided her with details about your mother's survivor benefits claim. The implications were clear. If a reporter was looking into her father's death and her mother's subsequent benefits, it wouldn't be long before someone discovered the pattern of hospital visits and emergency room treatments that had occurred during Sarah's teenage years. How much time do we have before this becomes public? Based on my experience with investigative journalists, probably no more than a week or two. Once they have a thread to pull, they tend to work quickly. Admiral Richardson opened one of the folders on his desk and removed several documents. That's why I wanted to propose an alternative approach. Rather than waiting for someone else to tell your story, we give you the opportunity to tell it yourself. He slid a document across the desk to Sarah. It was a memo from the Navy's Public Affairs Office outlining a proposed interview strategy that would allow her to discuss her background in a controlled environment. The idea would be to arrange an exclusive interview with a reporter we trust, someone who has a reputation for handling sensitive personal stories with appropriate discretion. You would have final approval over what information gets published, and we would coordinate the release to coincide with your award ceremony. Sarah read through the proposal, feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of managing public perception while trying to maintain some privacy about her personal trauma. Who would conduct the interview? We're recommending Sarah Mitchell from Military Times. She's covered military personnel issues for 15 years and has a reputation for treating sensitive subjects with respect. She's also a Navy veteran herself, so she understands the culture and the importance of protecting operational security. The proposal made sense from a strategic standpoint, but Sarah wasn't sure she was emotionally prepared to discuss her father's abuse with a journalist, even one who came recommended. Can I have some time to think about this? Of course, but I need an answer within the next few days. If we're going to control the narrative, we need to move quickly. Admiral Richardson's phone rang, and he glanced at the caller ID before looking back at Sarah. I need to take this call, but there's one more thing I wanted to discuss with you. He answered the phone briefly, confirming an appointment for later that afternoon, then hung up and gave Sarah his full attention again. Lieutenant, I've been thinking about our conversation in the hospital, particularly about your father's death. Have you ever considered requesting a review of the accident investigation? Sarah looked at him in surprise. Sir, what do you mean? Military accident investigations from that time period were sometimes less thorough than current standards require. Given what you've told me about your father's state of mind and behavior in the weeks before his death, it might be worth having a fresh pair of eyes examine the evidence. The suggestion opened up possibilities that Sarah had never seriously considered. For years, she had wondered about the circumstances of her father's death, but she had never imagined that official channels might be available to seek answers. Would that be possible? It's been 9 years since the accident. It's unusual, but not unprecedented, especially when new information comes to light that might be relevant to the investigation. Your insights into his mental state and behavior patterns could provide context that wasn't available to the original investigators. Sarah felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. Part of her desperately wanted to know the truth about her father's death, but another part worried about what that truth might reveal. If I requested a review, what would that involve? A formal inquiry would be opened, with access to all the original evidence, plus any new information you could provide. It would be conducted by investigators who weren't involved in the original case, ensuring objectivity. And if they concluded that it wasn't an accident, Admiral Richardson paused before answering. Then, your father's death would be reclassified accordingly, and your mother's survivor benefits might be affected. But, more importantly, You would have answers to questions that have been troubling you for nearly a decade. Sarah stared at the papers on Admiral Richardson's desk, trying to process everything he had told her. In the span of 30 minutes, she had learned she was receiving the Navy's second highest decoration, discovered that reporters were investigating her family background, been offered the chance to tell her story publicly, and presented with the possibility of finally learning the truth about her father's death. Sir, this is all happening very fast. Understand. And I want you to know that whatever decisions you make about any of these issues, you'll have the full support of this command. Your service record speaks for itself, and nothing about your personal history changes the fact that you're an exceptional officer. As Sarah left Admiral Richardson's office, her mind was spinning with the magnitude of the choices she faced. The simple act of pulling a fellow service member from a burning helicopter had set in motion a chain of events that would force her to confront every aspect of her painful past. She walked across the base toward her quarters, watching the late afternoon sun reflect off the water in the harbor. Somewhere out there, a new group of midshipmen was probably dreaming of the day they would serve their country with honor and distinction. Sarah wondered if any of them carried secrets as heavy as the ones she had been bearing for so many years. The next few weeks would determine not only how her heroism was remembered, but whether she could finally find peace with the trauma that had shaped her into the person she had become. For the first time since the helicopter crash, Sarah realized that the most dangerous part of her journey might still lie ahead. Sarah sat in the small conference room adjacent to Admiral Richardson's office, waiting for Sarah Mitchell from Military Times to arrive. After 3 sleepless nights of deliberation, she had decided to tell her story before someone else discovered it and told their version. The decision felt simultaneously liberating and terrifying. Admiral Richardson had arranged for the interview to take place in a neutral setting, with both a public affairs officer and a Navy chaplain present to provide support if needed. Sarah appreciated the thoughtfulness, but she knew that ultimately she would have to find the strength to discuss her father's abuse on her own terms. Sarah Mitchell entered the room carrying a small digital recorder and a notebook. She was in her 40s, with graying brown hair and kind eyes that immediately put Sarah at ease. Her handshake was firm, and her manner was professional but warm. "Lieutenant Shun, thank you for agreeing to this interview. I know this can't be easy for you. Thank you for being willing to handle this sensitively. Admiral Richardson speaks very highly of your work." Sarah Mitchell had covered military stories for 15 years, including several high-profile cases involving sexual assault and domestic violence within the ranks. She understood the courage it took for service members to speak publicly about personal trauma. "Before we begin, I want you to know that you have complete control over this process. If there's anything you're not comfortable discussing, just say so. If you want to take a break at any point, we'll stop. This is your story to tell." Sarah felt some of her tension ease. She had been dreading this moment for weeks, imagining hostile questions and invasive probing into her private pain. Sarah Mitchell's approach was exactly what she needed. "I've read the official reports about the helicopter crash and rescue operation," Sarah Mitchell continued. "Your actions were truly heroic. But I understand there's more to your story that provides context for the kind of person and officer you become." Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that once she started talking, there would be no going back. Her private trauma would become public knowledge, discussed and analyzed by strangers across the country. "My father was Commander James Chun. He served in the Navy for 22 years and was considered an exemplary officer by his superiors and peers. What they didn't know was that he was also an alcoholic who physically abused me and my mother for years." Sarah Mitchell's expression remained neutral and encouraging. She had learned long ago that the best way to help interview subjects discuss difficult topics was to create a space where they felt heard rather than judged. "Can you tell me when the abuse started?" "I was around 12 when it began. At first, it was just grabbing me too hard when he was angry or slapping me when I talked back to him. But as I got older and started standing up to him more, especially when he went after my mother, the violence escalated." Sarah found that once she started talking, The words came easier than she had expected. Years of keeping these secrets had built up enormous pressure, and finally, releasing them felt like opening a valve that had been sealed too tightly for too long. The worst incidents usually happened late at night, when he had been drinking. He would come home from the officers' club angry about something that had happened at work, and he would take out his frustrations on whoever was available. Did you ever seek medical treatment for your injuries? Several times. But he was always careful about where he hit me, and when I had to go to the emergency room, he would come with me and explain to the doctors that I had fallen downstairs or been in some kind of accident. The medical staff never questioned a Navy commander bringing in his injured daughter. Sarah Mitchell made notes as she listened, but her attention remained focused on Sarah's face. She could see the pain that discussing these memories brought back, but she could also see the strength that had allowed Sarah to survive and thrive despite everything she had endured. What was your mother's role in all of this? Sarah's expression grew more complicated. My mother was trapped in the same cycle of abuse, but she was too scared and emotionally broken to protect either of us effectively. She would promise me that things would get better, that he would change, but they never did. I think she was just trying to survive until I graduated high school and could get away from him. Is that what motivated you to apply to the Naval Academy? Partly, but I also wanted to prove that not everyone who wears this uniform is like him. I wanted to show that military leadership could be about protecting people instead of hurting them. The irony of following her abusive father into the same service that had shaped him was not lost on Sarah. But she had found in the Navy the family and sense of purpose that had been denied to her during childhood. How did your father react when you were accepted to the academy? He was furious. I think he saw it as a personal challenge to his authority and also as a risk to his reputation if I ever decided to tell anyone about what he had done to me. The violence actually got worse during my senior year of high school, once he knew I would be leaving. Sarah Mitchell had covered enough domestic violence cases to understand the dynamics Sarah was describing. Abusers often escalated their violence when they sensed their victims were about to escape their control. Your father died in a training accident just before you started at the academy. How did that affect you? This was the question Sarah had been dreading most. She had never spoken publicly about her suspicions regarding her father's death, and she wasn't sure she was ready to do so now. The official investigation ruled it pilot error. He was flying a routine training mission and made a series of uncharacteristic mistakes that resulted in a fatal crash. But you have questions about whether it was really an accident. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. When she looked up, Sarah Mitchell could see the uncertainty and pain in her eyes. He had been drinking more heavily than usual in the weeks before his death. There were going to be formal charges filed against him for a physical altercation with another officer, and he was facing forced retirement. He had always said he would rather die than lose his commission. Do you think he might have crashed deliberately? I don't know, and I've lived with that uncertainty for 9 years. Recently, Admiral Richardson suggested that I could request a review of the accident investigation, but I'm not sure I'm ready to learn the truth. Sarah Mitchell understood the complex emotions Sarah was experiencing. The possibility that her father had committed suicide rather than face the consequences of his behavior added another layer of trauma to an already devastating situation. How has carrying these secrets affected your military service? In some ways, I think it made me a better officer. I was determined to be everything he wasn't, to use my authority to protect and support the people under my command rather than abuse them. Every time I put on this uniform, I'm making a conscious choice to honor what it's supposed to represent. Is that what motivated your actions during the helicopter crash? Sarah considered the question carefully. She had been asked repeatedly about her heroism during the rescue operation, but no one had connected it to her personal history before. I think it was part of it. When I saw Petty Officer Martinez trapped in that wreckage, bleeding and unconscious, I couldn't leave him there. He has a family who depends on him, people who love him. I've seen what happens to families when violence is allowed to go unchecked. The connection between her childhood trauma and her adult heroism was becoming clear to Sarah Mitchell. Sarah Chun had transformed her personal pain into a driving force for protecting others. What do you hope people understand about your story? That domestic violence can happen in any family, even ones that look perfect from the outside. Military families face unique pressures that can make abuse easier to hide and harder to escape. And that it's possible to survive trauma and still build a meaningful life dedicated to serving something greater than yourself. Sarah Mitchell turned off her recorder and closed her notebook. Lieutenant Chun, thank you for trusting me with your story. I think it will help a lot of people who are dealing with similar situations. As Sarah Mitchell left the conference room, Sarah felt emotionally drained, but also relieved. For the first time in her adult life, she had told her complete story to someone whose job it was to share it with the world. The thought was both terrifying and liberating. Admiral Richardson entered the room a few minutes later, carrying 2 cups of coffee from his personal supply. He sat down across from Sarah and studied her face carefully. How did it go? Better than I expected. She was very professional and sensitive about the whole thing. Are you having second thoughts about going public? Sarah shook her head. No, I think it's time. I've been carrying this alone for too long, and maybe sharing it will help other people who are in similar situations. The article will be published next week, time to coincide with the announcement of your Navy Cross. Are you prepared for the reaction it might generate? Sarah had been thinking about that question constantly. Once her story was public, she would inevitably become a symbol for domestic violence survivors and military heroism. The attention would be intense and probably overwhelming. I'm as prepared as I can be. I know there will be people who question why I didn't speak up sooner, or who think I'm seeking sympathy or attention. But I also know there will be people who understand what I went through and find hope in the fact that I survived and built a successful career despite everything. Admiral Richardson had dealt with enough public relations situations to know that Sarah was right about both the positive and negative reactions her story would generate. The key would be managing the attention in a way that protected her while maximizing the positive impact her courage might have on others. There's something else we need to discuss, he said. I've been in contact with the investigators who would handle the review of your father's accident. They've agreed to expedite the process if you decide to move forward with it. The timing was both perfect and terrible. Sarah's public prominence would ensure that any findings from a renewed investigation would receive significant media attention. But it would also mean revisiting the most painful aspects of her past, just as she was trying to move forward with her life. What would the investigation involve? They would review all the original evidence, including the aircraft wreckage, maintenance records, and witness statements. They would also interview you about your father's mental state and behavior in the weeks before his death. The process would probably take several months. Sarah realized that she was facing another pivotal moment in her life. She could continue to live with uncertainty about her father's death, or she could pursue answers that might be painful, but would finally give her closure. If I request the investigation and they determine it was suicide, what happens to my mother's survivor benefits? That's complicated. Technically, suicide would disqualify her from some benefits, but there are provisions for cases involving mental health issues or extenuating circumstances. The investigators would make recommendations, but the final decision would be made by a benefits review board. Sarah thought about her mother, who had remarried 2 years after her father's death and was finally building a life free from fear and violence. She deserved the financial security that her survivor benefits provided, but Sarah also needed to know the truth about what had happened that day. I need to talk to my mother about this before I make a decision. She had a right to know what I'm considering and how it might affect her. That's wise. This isn't a decision you should make alone. Admiral Richardson stood to leave, then paused at the door. Sarah, whatever you decide about the investigation, I want you to know how proud I am to serve alongside you. You've shown more courage than most people display in a lifetime. After he left, Sarah sat alone in the conference room, watching the late afternoon sun stream through the windows. In less than a week, her story would be published, and her private trauma would become public knowledge. The thought was still daunting, but she felt ready to face whatever came next. She thought about Petty Officer Martinez, who was recovering well from his injuries and had returned to duty the previous week. He had thanked her repeatedly for saving his life, but Sarah knew that in many ways he had saved hers too, by giving her the opportunity to be the protector she had always wanted to become. He had helped her transform her pain into purpose. The scars on her ribs would always remind her of her father's cruelty, but they would also remind her of her own strength and resilience. Soon, the whole world would know about those scars and the story they told. Sarah was finally ready to let them see the morning Sarah's story was published. Her phone started ringing at 5:30 a.m. The first call was from Admiral Richardson, informing her that the Military Times website had already received over 10,000 views of the article in the first 3 hours. By noon, major news networks were requesting follow-up interviews, and by evening, her story was trending on social media platforms across the country. Sarah had requested permission to spend the day at her apartment off base, knowing she would need privacy to process the public reaction to her deeply personal revelations. She had turned off her phone after the 20th call from reporters, but she could still monitor the coverage through news websites and social media. The responses were everything she had expected and more. Thousands of people were praising her courage, sharing their own stories of abuse and survival, and expressing support for her military service. But there were also critics who questioned her motives, suggested she was seeking attention, or argued that her father's reputation was being unfairly destroyed based on unproven allegations. What surprised her most were the messages from other military personnel who revealed their own experiences with domestic violence, either as victims or as children of abusive service members. The scope of the problem was far larger than she had realized, hidden beneath the polished image of military families that the public typically saw. Around 3 o'clock, there was a knock at her door. Sarah peered through the peephole and saw her mother standing in the hallway, looking nervous and uncertain. They had spoken by phone several times since Sarah's decision to go public, but this was the first time they had seen each other face to face since the story broke. "Mom, I wasn't expecting you." Linda Chun looked older than her 52 years, but she had a peace in her expression that had been absent during Sarah's childhood. Her remarriage to a gentle accountant named Robert had given her the stability and safety she had never known with Sarah's father. "I drove down from Richmond as soon as I saw the article. I wanted to make sure you were okay." Sarah hugged her mother, feeling the familiar mix of love and frustration that characterized their relationship. Linda had been both victim and enabler during Sarah's childhood, and their relationship remained complicated by the shared trauma they had endured. "How are you handling all the attention?" Linda asked as they sat down in Sarah's small living room. "It's overwhelming. I knew there would be a strong reaction, but I wasn't prepared for the intensity of it. Some of the responses have been incredibly supportive, but others have been harder to read." Linda had been following the coverage as well, and she had seen some of the harsh comments questioning Sarah's decision to speak publicly about her father's abuse. The criticism hurt her as much as it did Sarah, perhaps more so because she felt responsible for not protecting her daughter better. "I'm sorry you're having to relive all of this because of my decision to tell the story," Sarah said. "Don't apologize. You did the right thing. I should have been braver when you were younger. I should have found a way to protect you and get us both away from him." This was a conversation they had attempted several times over the years, but never with complete honesty about the dynamics that had kept them trapped in an abusive household. Linda's guilt about her failure to protect Sarah remained one of the most difficult aspects of their relationship. "Mom, you were as much a victim as I was. He had you convinced that there was no way out, and maybe there wasn't. Military wives in the 1990s had fewer resources and support systems than they do now. That doesn't excuse the fact that I let him hurt you for years. I told myself that if we could just survive until you graduated high school, everything would be okay. But I was really just protecting myself and hoping the problem would resolve itself somehow." Sarah had inherited her mother's tendency towards self-blame, but she had learned through therapy and military training to recognize when guilt was counterproductive. Her mother had been psychologically broken by years of abuse, making it unrealistic to expect her to have had the strength to escape or fight back effectively. The important thing is that we both survived, and we're both building better lives now, Sarah said. That's what matters. Linda was quiet for a moment, then reached into her purse and pulled out a folder containing several documents. There's something I need to tell you about your father's death. Something I should have shared years ago. Sarah's heart rate increased as she saw the serious expression on her mother's face. After all the speculation and uncertainty about whether her father's crash had been accidental or deliberate, was she finally going to learn the truth? What is it? The week before he died, your father received notice that he was being investigated for financial misconduct in addition to the assault charges. He had been using his position to approve fraudulent contracts with vendors who were paying him kickbacks. This was information Sarah had never heard before. All the speculation about her father's state of mind had focused on the personal charges he was facing, not potential criminal activity that could have resulted in serious federal charges. How do you know about this? Because he told me the night before his final flight. He was drunk and ranting about how everything was falling apart, how his career was over, and he was going to end up in prison. He kept saying that he couldn't live with the shame of being exposed as a fraud and a criminal. Sarah stared at the documents her mother had brought, realizing that they might contain the missing piece of the puzzle about her father's death. Why didn't you tell the accident investigators about this? Because I was terrified. If they knew about the criminal investigation, there would have been more scrutiny of his death, more questions about our family situation. I was afraid they would discover the abuse and that somehow I would be blamed for not reporting it sooner. The revelation reframed everything Sarah thought she understood about her father's final days. The pressure he was facing hadn't just been about potential court-martial and forced retirement, but about the possibility of federal prosecution and imprisonment. Do you think he crashed the plane deliberately? Linda's voice was barely above a whisper when she answered. Yes, I think he couldn't face the consequences of what he had done, so he chose to die as a war hero rather than live as a criminal. Sarah felt a mix of relief and sadness at finally having an answer to the question that had haunted her for years. Her father had been facing complete personal and professional ruin, and rather than accepting responsibility for his actions, he had chosen suicide while making it look like an accident. Mom, I need to tell you something. Admiral Richardson has offered to have the accident reopened for investigation. They would review all the evidence and try to determine what really happened. Linda's face went pale. If they conclude it was suicide, what happens to my survivor benefits? That's one of the concerns. But there's also the possibility that proving it was suicide would provide closure for both of us, and it might help other families who are dealing with similar situations. Linda looked at the folder of documents she had brought, knowing that they contained evidence that could definitively answer the questions about her husband's death. These are copies of the criminal investigation files. Robert helped me request them through a Freedom of Information Act filing last year. I kept thinking I should give them to you, but I was afraid of what they might prove. Sarah opened the folder and began reading through the documents. The evidence of her father's financial crimes was overwhelming, involving hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent contracts over several years. He had been facing not just military justice proceedings, but potential federal prosecution that could have resulted in decades in prison. With this evidence, the accident investigators would probably be able to determine conclusively whether his death was suicide, Sarah said. What do you think we should do? Sarah had been wrestling with this question for weeks, but seeing the documentary evidence of her father's crimes made the decision clearer. Her father had chosen to escape accountability through death, leaving behind victims who deserve to know the truth. I think we need to pursue the investigation, not just for our own closure, but because other people deserve to know that military service doesn't excuse criminal behavior or domestic violence. Linda nodded slowly. You're right. And Maybe it will help other women who are trapped in abusive military marriages to understand that they have options their abusers might not want them to know about. They spent the next hour going through the criminal investigation files together, piecing together a pattern of corruption that had extended over years. Sarah's father had used his position as a supply officer to approve contracts with companies that were paying him substantial bribes, money he had used to fund his drinking and gambling habits. The scope of his criminal activity explained why he had been so violent and unpredictable during his final months. He had been living with the constant fear of discovery while trying to maintain his facade as an honorable naval officer. "There's something else," Linda said as they finished reviewing the documents. "Your father left a letter. I found it in his desk after he died, but I never showed it to anyone." She reached into her purse again and pulled out an envelope that had clearly been opened and refolded many times over the years. Sarah's name was written on the outside in her father's familiar handwriting. "He wrote me a letter. I think he knew he wasn't coming back from that flight." This was his way of trying to explain himself. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. Her father's handwriting was unsteady, suggesting he had been drinking when he wrote it. The letter was brief but devastating in its honesty. Her father acknowledged his abuse of both Sarah and her mother, admitting that his drinking and violence had destroyed their family. He also confessed to the criminal activity that had been discovered, expressing shame about his betrayal of his military oath. Most importantly, he explicitly stated his intention to crash his plane rather than face the consequences of his actions. He apologized to Sarah for the pain he had caused her, but also tried to justify his suicide by claiming it was better for everyone if he died as a hero rather than lived as a criminal. "He knew exactly what he was doing," Sarah said after reading the letter twice. "Yes, and he wanted to make sure you knew that his death wasn't an accident, but he was too much of a coward to face the consequences of what he had done while he was alive." Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions as she processed this final revelation about her father. The letter provided definitive proof that his death had been suicide, but it also showed that even in his final moments, he had been more concerned about protecting his reputation than taking responsibility for the damage he had caused. This letter and the criminal investigation files would make it impossible for the Accident Review Board to conclude anything other than suicide, Sarah said. "Are you prepared for what that means? The media attention will be intense, and there will probably be financial consequences for my benefits." Sarah looked at her mother, seeing the woman who had finally found peace and stability after years of fear and violence. The decision to pursue the truth about her father's death would affect both of them, but it would also provide answers to questions that had haunted them both for nearly a decade. "Mom, we've both spent too many years living with secrets and lies. Maybe it's time to finally tell the complete truth, no matter what the consequences are." Linda reached over and took Sarah's hand. "Then let's do it. Let's make sure everyone knows exactly who your father really was and what military families need to do to protect themselves from people like him." As the sun set outside Sarah's apartment window, mother and daughter sat together planning how they would present the evidence that would finally reveal the truth about Commander James Chen's death. The next morning, Sarah would contact Admiral Richardson and request that the accident investigation be reopened. The scars on Sarah's ribs would always remind her of her father's cruelty, but now they would also represent her courage in speaking the truth about military domestic violence. More importantly, they would serve as a testament to her determination to ensure that other families didn't have to endure the pain and secrecy that had defined her childhood. 6 months later, Sarah stood at the podium in the Pentagon's main auditorium, looking out at an audience of senior military officials, domestic violence advocates, and survivors who had come to hear her speak at the first annual conference on military family safety. The Navy Cross gleamed on her dress uniform, but the real measure of her achievement was the policy changes that had been implemented across all service branches in response to her story. The accident investigation into her father's death had concluded definitively that Commander James Chen had committed suicide to avoid facing criminal prosecution and court-martial proceedings. The revelation had generated additional media coverage, but it had also prompted a comprehensive review of how the military handled domestic violence cases and financial crimes committed by service members. Admiral Richardson, who had been promoted to head the Navy's new Family Safety Initiative, introduced Sarah to the assembled audience. Lieutenant Chen's courage in speaking publicly about her experiences has already saved lives and protected families across our military community. Her story reminds us that true honor comes not from maintaining a perfect image, but from having the strength to confront difficult truths. Sarah had given dozens of speeches over the past months, but this audience felt particularly significant because it included many people who were working to implement systemic changes based on lessons learned from her family's experience. 2 years ago, I was a helicopter pilot whose primary concern was executing successful missions and taking care of my crew. I had no intention of becoming a public figure or an advocate for domestic violence survivors. But sometimes life forces us to become the person we never planned to be. The audience was completely silent, understanding that they were hearing from someone who had transformed personal trauma into meaningful social change. The night I pulled Petty Officer Martinez from that burning helicopter, I was drawing on strength that had been built through years of surviving my father's abuse. Every scar on my body represents not just pain that I endured, but resilience that I developed. Those scars taught me that survival is possible even in the most hopeless situations. Sarah could see several people in the audience wiping away tears, including some senior officers who had children of their own and were imagining what Sarah had endured as a child. But survival isn't enough. Once we survive, we have an obligation to use our experience to protect others who are still trapped in dangerous situations. That's what military service is really about, using our strength to defend those who cannot defend themselves. The policy changes that had emerged from Sarah's story were comprehensive and groundbreaking. Military families now had access to confidential reporting systems that bypassed the chain of command, ensuring that domestic violence could be reported without fear of retaliation against the victim's career or benefits. Financial crimes by military personnel were subject to more rigorous oversight, and the connection between financial stress and domestic violence was explicitly addressed in family support programs. The most important lesson I've learned is that secrets protect abusers, not victims. When we stay silent about abuse, we enable it to continue. When we speak up, we create the possibility for intervention and change. Sarah looked out at the audience and saw her mother sitting in the third row, accompanied by her stepfather, Robert. Linda had become an advocate herself, working with military spouse organizations to educate women about resources available to help them escape abusive relationships. Her survivor benefits had been reduced following the reclassification of her husband's death, but she had found financial stability through her work and her new marriage. My mother taught me an important lesson recently. She said that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting what happened or excusing the person who hurt us. It means refusing to let their actions continue to control our lives. I have forgiven my father for what he did to me, but I will never forget the lessons his abuse taught me about the importance of protecting innocent people from those who would harm them. In the months following the publication of her story, Sarah had received thousands of letters and emails from survivors of domestic violence, many of them military families who had felt isolated and powerless to change their situations. The response had convinced her that speaking publicly had been the right decision, despite the personal cost. The military has made significant progress in addressing domestic violence in the past year, but we still have work to do. We need to create a culture where seeking help is seen as a sign of strength rather than weakness, where victims are believed and supported rather than blamed and ostracized. Admiral Richardson watched from the side of the stage, proud of the young officer who had transformed a personal tragedy into a force for institutional change. Sarah's case had become a model for how the military could better support families while maintaining operational readiness and discipline. I want to conclude by talking about the concept of honor, because that's what military service is supposed to be about. True honor isn't about maintaining a perfect image or avoiding accountability for our mistakes. True honor means having the courage to do what's right even when it's difficult, even when it costs us something personally. Sarah paused and looked directly at several senior officers in the front row, knowing that some of them had initially opposed the policy changes that emerged from her case. My father wore this uniform for over 20 years, but he never understood what honor really means. He thought honor was about rank and reputation and the respect of other people. But honor is actually about how we treat the most vulnerable people in our lives, how we use our authority to protect rather than harm, and whether we have the courage to admit our mistakes and make amends for the damage we've caused. The applause that followed was sustained and heartfelt, but Sarah wasn't finished with her remarks. When I first revealed my scars to Admiral Richardson, I was terrified that my past would destroy my military career. Instead, those scars became the foundation for everything meaningful I've accomplished since then. They remind me every day why I serve, and they give me the strength to continue fighting for families who are still living in fear. She unbuttoned the top of her dress uniform jacket slightly, revealing a small portion of the scarring on her chest that had become symbolic of her survival story. These scars will never completely fade, and I don't want them to. They are proof that it's possible to survive trauma and build something meaningful from the experience. They are proof that speaking the truth, even when it's painful, can change lives and save families. As Sarah stepped away from the podium, the audience rose in a standing ovation that continued for several minutes. She had become more than just a decorated naval officer. She had become a symbol of transformation and hope for survivors of domestic violence throughout the military community. After the conference, Sarah joined Admiral Richardson and several other senior officials for a private dinner to discuss future initiatives. The conversation focused on expanding the programs that had emerged from her case to address related issues like financial abuse, child neglect, and elder abuse within military families. "Lieutenant, I have some news that I think you'll find interesting," Admiral Richardson said as they finished their meal. "The Pentagon has approved funding for a new position, Director of Family Safety Advocacy. They've asked me to offer it to you." Sarah was surprised by the offer, which would represent a significant change in her career trajectory. The position would involve policy development, public speaking, and program oversight rather than operational flying duties. What would that involve exactly? You would be responsible for developing and implementing prevention programs, training military personnel to recognize and respond to domestic violence, and serving as the primary liaison between the military and civilian advocacy organizations. It would be a staff position here in Washington with opportunities for promotion and increased responsibility. The offer was tempting because it would allow Sarah to continue the advocacy work she had become passionate about, but it would also mean giving up the flying career she loved. "Can I have some time to consider it?" "Of course. This is a big decision, and I want you to make the choice that's right for your career and personal goals." As Sarah drove back to her hotel that evening, she thought about how dramatically her life had changed since that morning when she had first revealed her scars to Admiral Richardson. She had gone from being an unknown helicopter pilot to becoming a national spokesperson for military domestic violence prevention. The personal cost had been significant. Her privacy was gone forever, and she would always be defined in part by her father's abuse and her survival story. But the positive impact had been immeasurable. Military families now had resources and support systems that hadn't existed before, and the culture was slowly changing to become more protective of vulnerable family members. She thought about Petty Officer Martinez, who had fully recovered from his injuries and been promoted to Chief Petty Officer. He had written to thank her not just for saving his life, but for showing him what real leadership looked like under pressure. His words had meant more to her than any medal or commendation she had received. The scars on her ribs still ached sometimes when the weather changed, but they had become a source of strength rather than shame. They reminded her that survival was possible, that trauma could be transformed into purpose, and that speaking the truth could change the world for people who needed protection. 3 weeks later, Sarah accepted the position as Director of Family Safety Advocacy. On her first day in the new job, she received a letter from a young Army wife in Texas who had read Sarah's story and found the courage to leave her abusive husband with help from a new confidential reporting system. Lieutenant Shun, the letter read, "You probably don't remember me, but I was in the audience when you spoke at Fort Hood last month. I wanted you to know that your scars gave me permission to show mine. For the first time in years, I'm not afraid to go to sleep at night. Thank you for teaching me that survival is just the beginning of the story." Sarah pinned the letter to her office bulletin board, next to dozens of similar messages from military families whose lives have been changed by the policies and programs that emerged from her decision to speak publicly about her father's abuse. The scars would always be there, visible reminders of pain that could never be completely erased. But they had become something more powerful than evidence of her victimization. They had become proof of her transformation, symbols of hope for other survivors, and the foundation for a career dedicated to protecting military families from the violence that had shaped her own childhood. Admiral Richardson often said that true heroism wasn't measured by single acts of courage, but by the sustained commitment to use one's experiences in service of others. By that measure, Sarah Chun had become one of the most heroic officers in the history of the United States Navy, not because of what she had survived, but because of what she had built from the experience of surviving it. The helicopter crash that had revealed her scars to the world had been the beginning, not the end, of her most important mission. And every family that found safety and support through the program she had helped create was proof that sometimes the greatest victories come not from hiding our wounds, but from having the courage to show them to the world.